My experience of teaching English for academic purposes has shown me that English academic discourse is not usually much of a problem for Portuguese scientists. This is basically because Portuguese technical discourse is calqued on English and is therefore more or less identical to it. Secondly, many Portuguese scientists have actually learned their subject through English, using English language textbooks when they were students, and then later attending international conferences and reading international journals. Therefore, this means they will have imbibed the basic principles quite effortlessly. Therefore, in this section, I am planning to concentrate on two grammatical issues which do sometimes cause a problem because of their differences with Portuguese. The first is nominalizations, and the second is impersonal verb forms. So let us look first then at nominalizations. Now, these are linguistic structures that are smaller than a sentence and are built around a noun. They're also called noun phrases in English. In Portuguese, sintagma nominal. And they are very important because in technical discourse, almost all the semantic content is transmitted by nouns. And the verbs that are available are limited in range and serve merely to link these noun phrases together. I'm going to show you some examples from different disciplines to illustrate this. Here is an example from biochemistry. Now, if I highlight the noun phrases in red, you will see that they actually occupy most of the text. The same applies for the second example from chemical engineering. And here we have the noun phrases highlighted. But my best example actually comes from geology. Now, this consists of two complex noun phrases joined by a simple verb chronicled. Let me read it to you. Temporally changing major and trace elements of magmatic rocks from this paleo-arc system chronicled gradual crustal thickening prior to and substantial crustal thickening contemporaneously with crustal shortening. Now, that is actually a very simple sentence grammatically. All it has is a subject, a verb, and an object. The verb is chronicled, and everything that comes before it is the subject, and everything that comes after it is the object. But it looks complicated because the nouns that form the subject and the object have been expanded by the addition of modifying information. Let's have a closer look at how this works. Now, here we have some of the noun phrases from those previous examples. Now, a noun phrase or nominalization is built around a main noun, which is called the head. And in all of these examples, the head has been highlighted in bold. The main head has been highlighted in bold. And as you can see, we can modify it by putting information either before or after the head. Before the head, in addition to articles such as the and a, we can get simple adjectives such as isolated in the first one, rapid in the second. We can have compound adjectives. Now, these tend to be hyphenated, such as clathrin coated, or in the fourth sentence, multi-component. And they can also be modified by other nouns, such as trace elements in the last sentence. Trace is a noun which is modifying the head elements. As regards post-modification, all the examples that we have here of information following the head are prepositional phrases which consist of a preposition such as of or in or for or at or to, followed by another noun phrase. This means then that the structure of these noun phrases is recursive, because we can get noun phrases inside noun phrases, inside noun phrases, infinitely. So in these sentences, as I said, the main head is given in bold, but any secondary head we have is given in italics, and in the last sentence we've even got a tertiary head, which I have underlined. Now, the problem for Portuguese speakers is that in Portuguese, all the modifying information, with the exception of the article, goes after the head. And so Portuguese authors, when writing in English, will have difficulties in knowing how and when to use pre-modification. Now, I'd like to have a look more closely at how complex noun phrases are constructed. And let's have a look first of all at pre-modification. Now, the example I've got here is from computing. So I'm starting with the head memory. One type of memory in which data can be accessed in any random order is called a random access memory. Now, in Portuguese, that has to be expressed with post-modification. Memória de acesso aleatório. In English, random access should be hyphenated because it's a compound adjective. Now, this can then be further modified, for example, by adding another adjective. Dynamic random access memory. This is often abbreviated to DRAM. And now this DRAM can be used to modify another noun, as in DRAM errors, which in turn can be used to form others, as in DRAM error rates or DRAM error behaviour. Note that when a noun is modifying another noun, as is the case of error, it needs to be in the singular, not in the plural. That is a grammatical rule. Now, we can continue this process by adding post-modification. Let's begin with our DRAM error behaviour. We can modify this further by adding a prepositional phrase, DRAM error behaviour, in the field. Or we could also add a relative clause. Relative clauses typically begin with relative pronouns such as that or which or who. Or we could use a participle phrase, as in this example, DRAM error rates required for analysis. Participle phrase is basically a relative clause, a reduced relative clause, where the relative pronoun has been omitted. So it begins with a participle. In this case, it's a past participle, but we could equally form these using present participles, which is the ing form of the verb. Now, as with pre-modification, these can be piled up on top of each other to create some very, very complex nominalizations with noun phrases inside noun phrases. And in fact, the secondary heads have been marked with italics in these sentences. We can depict the structure of complex noun phrases like this. As you'll see, the main noun, the head, is in the centre of the chart. And before it, we can get articles, adjectives, compound adjectives, remember they are hyphenated, and other nouns, which need to be in the singular. And after the head, we can have prepositional phrases, relative clauses, and participle phrases. Let us return then to the dilemma. As English, unlike Portuguese, permits both pre-modification and post-modification, the dilemma is always about when to do what. Now, post-modification is always clearer because it is more explicit, as with this example from engineering. Pre-modification, on the other hand, is less explicit because it does not show the relationships between the various components, but it is more compact. So we see we've got here two of these cardinal virtues of English academic writing coming into conflict, clarity versus economy. Sometimes it is possible to do an intermediate solution, a kind of compromise, which gets the best of both, as in this example. So when should we use which form? Well, The basic rule depends upon whether the information contained in the noun phrase is new to your reader or not. Typically, the first time a nominalisation is introduced, either into the system as a whole or into the individual text, it will be expressed in its post-modified form for clarity, as in this example. Then once it has been introduced, it can then be repackaged into the more compact pre-modified form. In this particular example, I should point out it was not necessary to reproduce the prepositional phrase for wireless sensor networks, because this was understood in the context. Therefore, we can just leave it elliptical. Therefore, English has this pre-modification facility, which is a very useful way of repackaging information that has already been presented for the purpose of economy. And this allows the discourse to move forward more smoothly onto new subjects. However, it does not exist in Portuguese or in other Romance languages, and therefore can cause problems for the speakers of those languages. Now, alongside nominalizations, another important characteristic of the grammar of scientific and technical discourse in English is the use of impersonal verb forms, which shift the focus from the subjective observer to the object of study. There are several forms, but one of the most significant is the agentless passive, and this serves a number of different rhetorical functions. Here are some examples. Now, this extract is taken from the geology text we looked at earlier, and we can see here that the passive focuses on events that are occurring in the physical world without any human agency. In the second example, the passive has a universalizing function, in that it removes any idiosyncrasy or doubt from the results or the observations, therefore presenting them as unequivocal fact. In the third example, the passive implies that the result of a study does not depend upon the individual observer, but that it could be replicable by any qualified scientist under similar circumstances. And finally, in the fourth example, the passive emphasises the communality of the scientific project. Now, the concept itself is not inherently problematic for Portuguese speakers, because Portuguese also has a passive, an agentless passive. In fact, it has two. It has one which is formed in the same way as English, with the verb to be, ser, followed by the past participle. And it has a second one, which is perhaps even more common, the reflexive, formed with the clitic s. Now, the problems arise because of a device that is very common in Portuguese technical discourse, but is not grammatically possible in English, and that is a phenomenon known as verbal fronting. And this is when the verb is placed in initial position in the clause or the sentence. Let me show you some examples of verbal fronting in Portuguese. Now, this word order is not possible in English, because you cannot begin a sentence with a verb unless it's a question. Hence, these structures require reformulation. There are a number of different solutions that we can use, but each one has its drawbacks. For example, in some cases we can simply change the word order and make sure that we put the subject in initial position, as in this example here. However, this can be problematic if the subject is very long and complex, because it will mean that the verb is deferred for too long, creating something which is called a top-heavy sentence in English, and which is considered to be bad style. In that situation, and that would be the case, for example, in this second sentence, one of the things we can do is simply convert it to the active voice. However, this involves the introduction of the human subject, the agent, which may not be appropriate for all registers and disciplines. A third solution is something which is called the impersonal active. And this is when we use an active verb, but with an inanimate subject. This is very common in English inane statements, as in the example given here. And finally, the fourth alternative is to reformulate it with it. However, at this point, I think I should issue a warning, because this structure is often misused. It is not possible to use it in many cases, such as these ones given here, because it involves a duplication of the subject. And in my experience as a teacher of English for academic purposes, this is one of the most common mistakes that my students make. Okay, to conclude this section then, both of these features, nominalizations and impersonal verb forms, are essential components of the grammar of English academic discourse, and they serve the scientific agenda by placing the focus of the sentence firmly upon the object of study. They can raise certain problems for Portuguese scientists, as we have seen, chiefly because of mother tongue interference, but these problems are nothing like those experienced by Portuguese humanities scholars, who are used to a completely different discourse based upon entirely different epistemological premises, and this will be the subject of my next section.